A waiter with a racist attitude sees a black woman at a fancy restaurant and intentionally gives her terrible service. However, little did he know that the black woman was the wife of the restaurant's owner. Sarah Thompson, a confident and elegant woman, walked into Bellagio Luxe, the restaurant she and her husband Jack Thompson often dined at. Her high heels made soft, rhythmic clicks on the gleaming marble floor. Bellagio Luxe, a renowned restaurant that Jack had spent years building, exuded luxury and warmth. The soft lighting, gentle music coming from speakers in the ceiling, and the quiet chatter of well-dressed diners created a cozy ambience. Sarah usually felt comfortable and relaxed whenever she came here. She loved the upscale yet friendly atmosphere, where every detail was meticulously attended to. On previous visits, when she and Jack dined together, the staff would always greet them with smiles, serve them attentively, and the restaurant's vibe made her feel like she was in one of the most special places in the world. But tonight, something was off. A subtle unease crept into her heart as she stepped through the door. Jack had a meeting across town, and even though he suggested she go ahead and order, Sarah felt a bit odd sitting alone at a small table in the corner of the restaurant. She looked around, seeing well-dressed couples enjoying their meals, their laughter and soft conversations adding to the cozy atmosphere. The fashionable outfits and glowing candlelight made everything seem perfect, yet Sarah's mood didn't match. After sitting down and adjusting her chair, a light sense of anxiety crept in. Maybe it was because she was sitting alone in a space she usually shared with Jack. She was used to having him by her side, someone who always made things feel more comfortable. Now, sitting alone with no one to share her meal with, she felt a bit empty, wondering if coming in early was the right decision. Sarah tried to reassure herself, reminding herself that Jack would arrive soon and things would settle. But as she sat there, watching the other diners around her, her unease didn't subside. The restaurant was busy, but everything was orderly, with no signs of anyone being rushed. Yet the odd feeling in her gut remained, like something wasn't quite right. And then a waiter appeared by her side. He was tall, blonde, dressed in the restaurant's standard black and white uniform, but instead of offering the usual warm smile, he didn't smile at all. He didn't greet her politely as the other staff did, but glanced at Sarah with a look of indifference. His name tag read, Brad. "Are you ready to order?" Brad asked in a curt, cold tone, showing no enthusiasm. Sarah was taken aback by Brad's unprofessional attitude. Normally, the staff at Bellagio Luxe were polite and welcoming. She had never faced such treatment here. Hesitantly, she looked at the empty table in front of her and decided just to order water for now. "I'll just have some water first. I'll order food later," she said softly. Brad scribbled something on his notepad, his expression unchanged, with no warmth or interest. "All right," he responded flatly, quickly turning away without another word. Sarah sat quietly watching Brad walk away. She couldn't help but notice the stark difference in how he treated her compared to other diners. As soon as he left her table, Brad immediately attended to another nearby table, a well-dressed middle-aged couple. This time he smiled brightly, chatting warmly and pouring wine for them, before moving on to another table with the same enthusiastic attitude, in complete contrast to how he had treated her. Sarah shook her head slightly, trying to brush off the uneasy feeling. She told herself maybe Brad was just having a bad day. But a doubt began to grow in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She waited for her water, but the anxiety in her heart only grew stronger. Time passed slowly, and she began to feel like she was being ignored in the very restaurant she and her husband frequently visited. Brad, the only waiter who had interacted with her that evening, had not returned since he took her water request. She sat at the table, glancing around the restaurant, hoping to see some sign that he would be back soon. But all she saw was one thing. Brad had completely ignored her. As she waited, Sarah couldn't help but notice how Brad served the other tables. She watched as he not only brought drinks, but also carefully refilled glasses at each table. A couple sitting not far from her was warmly welcomed, with Brad chatting and even throwing in a few jokes that made the diners laugh. Seeing this made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. The service the other patrons received was starkly different from how he treated her. She couldn't understand why she was being treated this way, while everyone around her seemed to be enjoying their evening. The moments of silence dragged on uncomfortably. Sarah wondered to herself, is he just too busy? Or am I overthinking? But as she continued to see Brad attentively serving other tables, while not even glancing in her direction, her frustration became undeniable. She couldn't ignore the fact that, although the restaurant was busy, Brad was deliberately avoiding her. The feeling of being overlooked and disrespected made Sarah restless. This wasn't the first time she had experienced a situation like this. Being ignored or receiving subpar service compared to other customers had happened too many times in her life. However, what shocked her was that it happened at Bellagio Luxe, a place where she had always felt welcomed and valued when with Jack. Tonight, sitting alone, everything felt different. She no longer felt the respect she had always experienced here. Sarah's phone buzzed, breaking the heavy silence. It was a text from Jack. "I'll be a bit late. Go ahead and order without me." She sighed and quickly typed back, "Okay, I'll wait." But her disappointment was becoming more apparent. She hoped Jack could arrive soon to make her feel less out of place and tense in this situation. As she looked around, Sarah noticed that the restaurant was still bustling with energy and warmth. Other tables were being served promptly. Wine glasses were always full, food was continually being brought out, and the sound of laughter and chatter filled the air. Everyone seemed to be having a perfect evening. But she, sitting alone in the corner, still didn't have the simple glass of water she had asked for nearly 15 minutes ago. Her frustration turned into anger, and Sarah felt she couldn't stay silent any longer. She sat up straight, her expression determined. It was clear that Brad was purposely ignoring her, and that was unacceptable. In fact, she had seen signs like this before. Subtle, not too obvious, but enough for her to realize that she was being discriminated against. She had faced such situations too many times in the past, but this time, she couldn't let it slide. Just then, a young waitress walked past her table. Sarah recognized the girl, named Emily, someone she had interacted with on previous visits, and she always remembered Emily as warm and friendly. Sarah raised her hand slightly to signal her. "Excuse me, I've been waiting quite a while for some water," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm but unable to hide the disappointment in her eyes. "Could you bring me a glass, please?" Emily stopped immediately, her expression showing surprise and regret. "Oh, I'm so sorry, there must have been a mix-up. I'll get that for you right away." Emily quickly went to the counter, and within a few minutes she returned with a cold glass of water that Sarah had requested. Sarah thanked Emily with a slight smile, but inside she still felt the simmering frustration. She took a sip, feeling the cool water touch her lips, but it did nothing to cool her anger. Brad's neglect had made her feel disregarded and disrespected. Looking around the restaurant again, she saw Brad continuing to serve other tables with the same care and enthusiasm that he had shown everyone else except her. The glass of water was now just a symbol of a larger problem. This wasn't about a delayed drink anymore. It was about the way she had been treated with blatant disrespect and discrimination. In Sarah's heart, she knew she wasn't being overly sensitive or demanding. The difference in service between her and the other customers was too obvious to ignore. She decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. The discomfort had turned into a strong resolve, and she knew she had to act. Sarah was no longer willing to wait or hope that Brad would realize his mistake on his own. She felt the need to confront this issue directly, clearly, and immediately. Just at that moment, she saw Brad emerging from the kitchen, carrying a tray full of food. He walked past her table without even glancing at her, as if he hadn't noticed her presence at all. Sarah decided she wouldn't wait any longer. As Brad approached, she sat up straight and called out to him politely but firmly. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice soft but with a hint of firmness. "Can I place my order now? I've been waiting quite a while." Brad paused, slightly taken aback as if he hadn't expected to be called on at that moment. He turned his head to look at Sarah, and his indifferent attitude returned immediately. There was no welcoming smile, no friendliness in his eyes. Brad walked over to her table, his lips pressed tightly together, as if he was only doing this out of obligation. "What would you like to order?" he asked, his voice curt and impatient. His attitude hadn't changed since the beginning. There was no apology for making her wait so long, nor was there any of the enthusiasm he had shown to other customers. Sarah took a deep breath to stay calm. She could feel the blood rushing to her face, and the frustration she had been holding back began to rise. She was used to being treated with respect in this restaurant, which made Brad's behavior tonight all the more insulting. But Sarah knew she didn't want to let her emotions take over. She kept her voice calm but firm. "I've been sitting here for nearly 30 minutes and you haven't come back to take my order," Sarah said, her eyes not leaving Brad. "I've seen you serve all the other tables with care, but I haven't received the same service. Is there a reason I've been waiting so long?" Brad raised an eyebrow slightly, then shrugged indifferently. "We're busy," he replied, his tone still abrupt. "The restaurant is pretty full tonight and I can't serve everyone at the same time." Sarah felt a wave of frustration and disbelief. Brad's excuse didn't make sense, especially since she had seen him quickly and happily serving other customers. The restaurant might be busy, but there was no reason she should be ignored while everyone else received attentive service. She kept her voice calm but sharper. "I understand the restaurant may be busy, but it's clear you've had time to serve other tables without any issues. Why have I been overlooked?" She looked directly into Brad's eyes, hoping the clarity of her words would force him to confront the issue. Brad stared at her for a moment, then suddenly gave a forced, insincere smile. It wasn't a genuine smile, but more of a mocking expression. "Maybe you're just being too sensitive," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'll take your order now, but if you want quicker service, maybe you should try eating somewhere else." Brad's words were like a slap in the face to Sarah. She was stunned for a moment, unable to believe what she had just heard. Not only had he dismissed her feelings, but he had also suggested she should leave if she didn't like the service. His disrespectful remark pushed her frustration to its limit. Sarah had faced subtle discrimination before, but never had anyone directly said something like this to her in a supposedly professional setting. Sarah took a deep breath to maintain her composure. She didn't want to lose control in this situation, but she also couldn't let Brad continue to treat her with such disrespect. She knew she had to confront him, not just for herself, but to show that she wouldn't tolerate this injustice. "Sensitive," Sarah repeated, her voice low but sharp. "I'm simply asking for basic service, the same service you've given every other customer in this restaurant tonight. If you can't give me that respect, then the problem isn't with me, it's with how you're doing your job." Brad stared at her, his eyes flickering with annoyance and anger. He seemed unsure how to react to Sarah's firm response. There was a tense silence between them for a moment, before Brad sighed and opened his small notepad. "What do you want to order?" he asked, his voice now cold and completely lacking in any friendliness. Sarah looked at him for a moment, then decided to order without hesitation. "I'll have the house special," she said, keeping her voice steady. And Brad quickly scribbled in his notepad and then turned away without another word. Sarah watched him walk off, her frustration and disappointment boiling inside. This wasn't just about bad service. This was about disrespect and, perhaps worse, discrimination she had become all too familiar with throughout her life. She sat alone, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. On previous visits with Jack, she had always felt respected and welcomed at Bellagio Luxe. But tonight, without her husband by her side, she realized that not everything was as it seemed. She began to understand that the problem wasn't the restaurant's busyness, but something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. Sarah sat quietly by herself, fully aware that this wasn't just a case of poor service. What had happened tonight was a clear display of discrimination that she could no longer ignore. Time passed slowly and Brad still hadn't returned. Meanwhile, Sarah couldn't help but notice how all the tables around her were being served quickly and attentively. Wine glasses were still being filled, food was continuously brought out, and the friendly smiles of the waitstaff remained throughout the restaurant. except for her. Sarah's patience was wearing thin as she felt increasingly isolated, as if she didn't deserve the same treatment as any other customer. It had been nearly 45 minutes since she placed her order, and there was no sign that her meal was coming. She picked up her phone, thinking about texting Jack to share her frustration, but then she hesitated. She didn't want to bother him while he was still in his meeting. She felt this was something she needed to face and handle on her own. Suddenly, Sarah decided that she couldn't sit and endure this any longer. She didn't want to be silent and let this subtle discrimination go unchallenged. She had spent her whole life dealing with situations like this, where disrespect was never explicitly spoken, but still evident in how she was treated, simply because of her skin color. But this time, she wasn't going to. Stay quiet. Sarah knew she needed to stand up for herself and wouldn't let Brad or anyone else disregard her in a restaurant that she and Jack had come to feel at home in. She looked around and saw Emily, the waitress who had brought her water earlier, walking by. Sarah raised her hand, and Emily immediately came over, her face as warm and friendly as ever. "Excuse me, but I've been waiting quite a long time and still haven't received my food. I ordered the house special more than 40 minutes ago," Sarah said, her voice calm but laced with clear frustration. Emily immediately looked concerned. "I'm so sorry, Ma'am. Let me check with the kitchen right away," she said quickly before hurrying off. As Sarah waited for Emily to return, she could feel curious glances from the surrounding tables. Some of the diners looked up at her, then quickly returned to their meals. She was all too familiar with those looks. Expressions of curiosity mixed with discomfort, but none of them dared to speak up or intervene. Their silence only made Sarah feel even more alone in this quiet battle. A few minutes later, Emily returned, her face tense with worry. "I just checked with the kitchen, and they said they never received your order," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm really sorry, but it looks like your order wasn't entered into the system." Sarah stared at Emily, shock and anger rising inside her. "Brad took my order. How could it not have been entered?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and anger. It was clear this wasn't just a small mistake. Brad had deliberately neglected her order, and this wasn't just a typical service error. Emily bowed her head, apologizing again. "I'm really sorry. Let me call him over to sort this out." Sarah sat up straight, her eyes fixed on the kitchen where she knew Brad was. She had decided that she wouldn't let this slide without confronting him. She felt disrespected, not only by the poor service, but by the clear disregard for her as a person. This wasn't a simple mistake. It was deliberate and intentional discrimination. Moments later, Brad appeared, walking slowly towards Sarah's table. He didn't look embarrassed or worried. Instead, his indifferent and unfriendly attitude remained unchanged. What had been subtle ignorance earlier had now transformed into blatant defiance. "Is there a problem?" Brad asked, his voice flat and expressionless, showing no hint of regret. Sarah looked him straight in the eye, her anger rising, but she remained calm. "The problem is you didn't put my order into the system," she said clearly. "I've been sitting here for nearly an hour with no word on my food. You've served every other table but ignored me." Brad shrugged as if it wasn't a big deal. "Maybe there was a mix-up. The restaurant's busy," he said, showing no sincerity in his tone. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. "This isn't a mix-up," she said, her voice sharp. "You've ignored me from the beginning, and now you're trying to blame the busyness to cover up your behavior. I'm not going to accept this. I came here to be served like any other customer, not to be disrespected and ignored." Brad stood silently for a moment, then shrugged again, saying nothing. His indifference only fueled Sarah's anger. She knew she had made the right decision not to stay silent, but this issue couldn't stop here. She knew she needed to take this higher, to the one person who could make it right. Jack. Just then the restaurant door opened, and Sarah saw Jack walking in with his usual strong, confident stride. She felt a wave of relief at the sight of him. Jack's presence made her feel less alone in this tense situation. Jack, with his sharp eyes, quickly sensed that something was wrong. He looked around, noticing the curious stares from the surrounding tables and the tension in the air. When his eyes met Sarah's, he hurried over to her, his face full of concern. "Are you all right?" Jack asked, sitting down beside Sarah, his voice gentle but serious. Sarah quickly explained what had happened from the moment she walked into the restaurant, detailing how Brad had ignored her, failed to put in her order, and finally his dismissive and disrespectful attitude when she tried to address the issue. Jack listened quietly, but his eyes grew colder as he heard the full story. He turned to look at Brad, who was still standing nearby with an indifferent expression, as if what had just happened wasn't important. Jack, as the owner of the restaurant, couldn't tolerate this. This wasn't just about poor service, it was a blatant act of discrimination against the person he loved most. Jack stood up, calm but exuding authority. He walked over to Brad, his eyes locked on the waiter with a determination that no one could ignore. Brad, realizing that Jack was approaching, straightened up slightly but still maintained his hardened attitude, as if he didn't believe he had done anything wrong. "Brad," Jack began, his voice steady but powerful, "I've heard that you've left my wife sitting here for an hour without proper service, even failing to put her order in. Can you explain to me what's going on?" Brad hesitated for a moment, then tried to keep his voice calm. "We're busy tonight, Mr. Thompson. There might have been a small mistake. It wasn't intentional. I just couldn't serve everyone at once." Jack raised an eyebrow, not hiding the skepticism in his gaze. "A small mistake? Can you explain why every other customer has been served attentively, but my wife has been ignored all evening? That doesn't sound like a small mistake." Brad began to look uncomfortable. I didn't realize she was your wife. If I had known, I would have taken better care of her." Brad's words left both Sarah and Jack stunned for a moment. He had not only admitted that he had discriminated against Sarah, but he also implied that if he had known she was the owner's wife, he would have treated her better. This only made it clear that the issue wasn't just bad service. It was intentional discrimination. Jack stayed calm, but his eyes grew sharper than ever. "So if she wasn't my wife, she doesn't deserve to be treated with the same respect as everyone else?" he asked, his voice cold and authoritative. Brad took a step back, clearly feeling the pressure from Jack. No, that's not what I meant." He stammered, trying to find an excuse, but Jack didn't give him a chance. "The issue isn't that she's my wife," Jack continued, his voice low but full of authority. "The issue is that she's a customer and deserves to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. This restaurant doesn't tolerate any form of discrimination, and what you've done is unacceptable." Brad looked confused, his face beginning to pale as he realized the situation was more serious than he had thought. He tried to come up with an excuse, but his words faltered, unable to explain away his behavior. Jack's eyes never left Brad's, and the tension in the room seemed to grow as the confrontation between them intensified. "One more thing, Brad," Jack said, his voice even lower now. "It's not because she's my wife that she deserves respect. She, like everyone else who walks into this restaurant, deserves to be treated fairly without discrimination. Do you understand that?" Brad stood in silence, unable to speak, his face white as a sheet. Jack stared at him for a moment longer, then finally sighed. "Go home, Brad. My wife and I will speak with you later," Jack said, his voice still firm. Brad stood frozen for a few seconds, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard, but then, without another word, he turned and walked away, not daring to look back at Sarah or Jack. The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent for a moment, as all eyes followed Brad's departure. Sarah sat quietly, feeling a sense of relief that the situation had finally come to a head, but she knew this wasn't over. Jack, his face serious, sat back down beside Sarah, but his mind was still processing everything that had happened. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, his voice gentle but still carrying the firmness of someone who had just dealt with an unacceptable situation. Sarah nodded, but her eyes still reflected the tension from the confrontation. "I'm better now, but what bothers me is that he only changed his attitude when he found out I'm your wife. That shows he thought he could ignore me and no one would care." Jack squeezed Sarah's hand, his eyes showing a hint of sadness. I know, and that's unforgivable. This isn't just about a bad employee. He thought he could act that way because you're a black woman sitting alone. The truth in Jack's words made Sarah feel both sad and angry. She knew Jack was trying to stay calm and handle things professionally, but she could also sense the deep frustration in his voice. Sarah sighed, gripping Jack's hand tightly. What worries me is that he's probably not the only one with that attitude. There could be others who think the same way. If you weren't here tonight, I'm not sure this would have been resolved like this. Jack nodded, his eyes thoughtful as he considered what Sarah had said. He understood exactly what she was feeling, and that was something he wanted to change. Bellagio Lux wasn't just a place for them to make a living. It was a symbol of the inclusion and mutual respect they had built together. But this incident had revealed a gap in the environment they had always believed was safe. We need to make it clear to all staff that discrimination in any form will not be tolerated, Jack said, his voice more serious than ever. Brad will face the consequences of his actions, and we will make sure no one else behaves like that in our restaurant. Sarah felt a sense of relief at Jack's strong words. She knew he wouldn't let this issue slide, but at the same time, she realized that they would likely face more challenges in the future. Discrimination, whether subtle or overt, still existed everywhere, even in a place they had always trusted. How do you plan to handle Brad? Sarah asked, her eyes still showing traces of worry. Jack sighed, his eyes reflecting a hint of weariness. I'll talk to him tomorrow, but I think I've already made my decision. Someone like Brad has no place at Bellagio Lux, no place in a restaurant we've built on respect and equality. Sarah nodded, knowing that Jack's decision was the right one. Brad's actions weren't just discriminatory toward her, but also damaging to the reputation and values of the restaurant they had worked so hard to create. She felt a certain peace, knowing that Jack wouldn't tolerate anyone violating the core principles they had set. Their conversation was briefly interrupted when another waiter brought a complete meal to their table, an unspoken apology from the kitchen. Sarah smiled at the waiter in thanks, but the meal was now just a small part of the overall situation. She and Jack sat together, feeling the peace gradually return, but both knew that the real storm would come tomorrow, when Brad would have to face the consequences of his actions. Tonight's incident was a painful reminder that even though they had created a space of respect, there were still individuals who harbored prejudice and bias. But with Jack, Sarah knew they had the strength to change that, at least within the space they controlled. A place where everyone was treated equally and fairly. Tomorrow would be the day Brad would pay the price, and Sarah hoped that by facing the consequences, others would learn that no one had the right to demean or discriminate against anyone, regardless of their position. The following morning. The atmosphere in Jack's office at Bellagio Lux was more tense than usual. Sarah sat in the chair across from Jack's desk, her eyes reflecting both determination and a bit of anxiety about the upcoming meeting. They knew that this wasn't just a discussion about poor service, but a confrontation about values and self-respect. Jack, seated behind his desk, was flipping through some papers, but it was clear his mind was focused on the meeting with Brad. They had decided to face Brad together, and today would be the moment to say what needed to be said. The discrimination Sarah had faced wasn't just a personal issue, but a matter of the restaurant's core principles. Jack knew this was an opportunity to make it clear that Bellagio Lux wouldn't tolerate any behavior that went against the values of equality they had always upheld. A light knock on the door echoed through the room, and Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken. Jack glanced at her, then with a deep breath motioned for Brad to come in. Brad entered, no longer showing any of the confidence or nonchalance from the night before. He looked tense, his shoulders slouched as if weighed down by an invisible burden. His eyes avoided direct contact with either Jack or Sarah as he sat in the chair opposite them, his hands trembling slightly. The room grew heavier as Jack began to speak. "Brad," Jack started, his voice low and firm, "I think you know why we need to talk today. What happened last night was unacceptable. I want to hear from you if you have anything to say about your actions." Brad lowered his head, his eyes still avoiding theirs, clearly fumbling for an explanation. "Mr. Thompson, I'm really sorry for what happened. I didn't mean to discriminate against anyone. I was just under pressure because the restaurant was busy and—" He trailed off, knowing his excuse didn't even convince himself. Sarah sat still, watching the tension on Brad's face. She had heard these types of excuses all her life. She knew Brad wasn't just under pressure. He had believed he could treat her like an unimportant customer simply because she was a black woman sitting alone. Jack looked at Brad, his eyes sharp. "Brad, I'm not here for excuses. This isn't just about poor service. You intentionally ignored my wife, and you only changed your attitude when you realized she was my wife. That means, if she weren't my wife, you would have continued to treat her with disrespect. Can you explain that?" Brad fumbled, his face paling as Jack laid out the core of the issue. I didn't mean... I'm really sorry. If I had known she was... I didn't mean to discriminate." Jack interrupted, his voice harder now. "The issue isn't whether she's my wife or not. The issue is that you ignored and disrespected a customer because you thought you could get away with it. That shows me you don't understand the values of this restaurant, and you don't respect customers the way every employee here is expected to." Brad remained silent, his face now filled with worry. He knew that no amount of excuses could justify his behavior. He had violated the core values of the restaurant, and now he had to face the consequences. Sarah decided to speak up, her voice calm but clear. "Brad, what hurt me the most wasn't just how you treated me, but the assumption you made that I wouldn't say anything, that I would just sit there and take it. You thought because I was a black woman sitting alone I wouldn't speak up. That's what you need to understand. You can't look down on people just because you think they're powerless." Brad lowered his head, completely silent. He had no words left, and the truth of the situation was clearer than ever. Jack looked at him once more, then with a soft sigh delivered the final decision. "Brad, I can't keep you employed at Bellagio Lux any longer. This restaurant has no place for people who don't understand and respect all customers. Your actions hurt my wife and damaged the reputation of our restaurant. You're fired." Brad didn't say anything, his face blank as he processed the final decision. He knew it was over. He stood up, not looking at anyone, and left the room without a word. When the door closed behind Brad, the tension in the office seemed to lighten. Sarah exhaled softly, feeling as if a heavy burden had been lifted. Jack turned to her, his eyes gentler now. "You did the right thing," Sarah said, her voice soft but resolute. "He needed to be held accountable for what he did." Jack nodded, taking her hand. "I can't let anyone undermine what we've built. Bellagio Lux will always be a place where everyone is treated with respect, and no one has the right to discriminate against any customer." Sarah smiled, feeling warmth and love from her husband. They had faced a major challenge together, and now they knew they had created a place that wasn't just a restaurant, but a symbol of equality and respect. The fight against discrimination may not be over, but at least within their space, Sarah and Jack had stood up for the values they believed in. So, as the morning passed, they sat together in the office, no longer feeling the tension and heaviness that had been present earlier. They had done what needed to be done, but Sarah knew this incident had left them both with a lot to reflect on. She turned to Jack, her eyes shining with determination. "I don't think this issue stops with Brad," Sarah began, her voice thoughtful but clear. "He's only a symptom of a bigger problem. This isn't the first time I've faced discrimination, and it probably won't be the last. We need to make sure that Bellagio Lux really is a place where everyone feels respected, no matter who they are." Jack quietly nodded, his eyes thoughtful as he considered what Sarah had said. He knew his wife was right. Although they had dealt with Brad, this was only a reflection of a larger issue. Bellagio Lux was their pride and joy, but because of that, they had to do more to uphold their values. "I agree," Jack replied after a moment of silence. "We can't just deal with individual cases. We need to create a culture of service based on respect and fairness. That means I need to talk to all the staff and make sure no one brings discriminatory attitudes into this place." Sarah smiled, feeling proud of Jack. She knew he always had a broader vision and was willing to stand up for what was right. It's important we take action now, she said. If we don't, situations like this will keep happening, and our customers, especially those who are marginalized, will feel like they don't belong here. Jack stood up, walking to the window and looking out at the street. Bellagio Lux, with its large glass windows and elegant interior, was his and Sarah's pride. But now he realized they had a responsibility beyond just providing top-tier dining. It was about creating a place where everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, felt safe and welcomed. "We'll start by holding a training session for all the staff," Jack said, turning back to face Sarah. "I want everyone to understand that Bellagio Lux isn't just a fancy restaurant. It's a place where respect and fairness are core values. If anyone can't grasp that, they don't belong here." Sarah nodded in agreement, feeling as though a weight had been lifted. She understood that their actions weren't just about protecting themselves, but also about protecting others who might not have the strength to speak up. She and Jack weren't just running a restaurant, they were shaping a space where everyone could feel safe and treated fairly. "We should also open up more conversations with our customers," Sarah suggested. "They need to feel that we care about them, not just as customers, but as people. Having open conversations could help us better understand their experiences and ensure that anyone who walks through our doors feels valued." Jack smiled at his wife. "You always think of the things I haven't yet," he said admiringly. "You're right. We need to listen more to our customers, so they know Bellagio Lux is a place for everyone without exception." Sarah felt warmth spread through her heart. Together they had built this restaurant from the ground up, and now they continued to protect it from anything that could undermine the values they had established. "I believe that after this we'll only be stronger," Sarah said, her voice full of confidence. "Brad was just one of the challenges we'll face, but the important thing is that we never compromise on what we believe in." Jack walked over and took her hand, his eyes glowing with determination. "We've faced many challenges and we'll keep facing them," he said. "But I know that together, we'll overcome them all." They sat quietly for a moment, enjoying the peace after the storm. Bellagio Lux was not just a restaurant, it was a symbol of their determination and love. And they knew that no matter how many challenges lay ahead, they would face them together because they were defending not just a business, but the values most important to their lives. After their conversation, Sarah and Jack stepped out of the office, feeling lighter and more determined. They walked through the restaurant together, where the staff was busy preparing for the lunchtime service. Everything seemed back to normal, but Sarah knew something had changed, not just in the restaurant, but in their hearts. They walked through the neatly arranged tables, seeing the friendly faces of the staff, and Sarah felt a quiet pride. Bellagio Lux was not just a place for fine dining, but a place that embodied the values of respect and fairness they had committed to protecting. Jack paused before the large window looking out onto the street, where the sunlight streamed in, casting warm rays across the room. Sarah stepped up beside him, taking his hand in that brief moment of calm. "I've been thinking about Brad and everything that happened," Jack said, his eyes gazing into the distance. "But in the end, what we need to remember is that we stood up for what's important to us, and that will make us stronger." Sarah nodded, feeling the warmth in Jack's words. "That's right, this isn't just about dealing with a bad employee. This is about reshaping the values we want this restaurant to represent. Bellagio Lux is a place where everyone should feel welcome and respected, no matter who they are." They walked into the kitchen, where the chefs were busy preparing meals with focus and precision. The smiles and greetings from the staff made the kitchen feel more pleasant after the tension of the previous day. Sarah felt relieved knowing that their team was still aligned with the values that had built the restaurant. Jack turned to Sarah, a gentle smile on his face. "I think from here on we need to make sure that everyone fully understands what Bellagio Lux stands for. This isn't just a job, it's about serving with respect, and there's no room for discrimination." Sarah smiled back, her eyes shining with determination. "We'll make sure of that. And not just for us, but for everyone who steps through these doors. Everyone deserves respect." They both looked around their restaurant, knowing it was not just a place for dining, but a symbol of unity and respect. They knew there was still much work to be done, but with love and determination, they would continue to protect the values they had built. As they left the kitchen, the daylight streamed in through the front windows, lighting up the restaurant's interior. Sarah felt her heart lighten more than ever. They had faced a major challenge and overcome it together. In that moment, Sarah knew that Bellagio Luxe was not just a place for diners, but a place where everyone belonged, a place where no one had to endure injustice or discrimination. She and Jack would continue to lead it with respect and fairness, ensuring the restaurant remained a symbol of harmony and love, no matter what life outside might bring. Sarah and Jack had shown that respect and fairness were values that couldn't be compromised. Bellagio Luxe wasn't just a restaurant, it was a place that stood for unity and compassion. This story reminds us that everyone deserves respect, no matter their skin color or background. Standing up for what's right doesn't just change your own life, it makes the world a better place. If you found this story meaningful, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring stories. Thank you for reading.